So predictably, the Times runs the headline by shielding Boris Johnson as PM, and the rest of the coverage is a cover-up, a lot of it. So to understand the extent of the kind of falsification of the evidence by the media, it would be helpful to compare the pages of the papers, printed papers, with a wall full of posters. Let's say 100 pages of the newspapers, about 40 pages of the so-called news. So 40 separate posters stuck on walls, say, on the way to place A to B. And it is possible to have a look. And the headlines are the big poster headlines. So imagine that. So if there are 40 pages, 40 posters, all saying false things, how many persons looking at them, let alone reading the actual contents, but the contents underneath, but just being met with 40 false headlines, how many persons can have the mental, intellectual, evidential, or emotional, or physical resources to actually think about those and diagnose them and process them and to get to the truth? So that is why it is mass media, mass misleading, because most people don't have that kind of ability. So when they look at the newspapers, supposing that persons who read the papers and buy them buy on average one paper. So they've got 40 posters in one paper. And they don't have the facilities, the resources to process them correctly and to get to the actual truth correctly. So this is what has been happening with the newspapers on any issue. Most of the issues in this country, in Britain, and about the world from Britain, and the perspective, the actual standpoint, the viewpoint that is presented consistently or persistently has been one that has been invented by the controllers of the agenda and the controllers of the means of production. It's not the ordinary people who pay for the papers or buy the papers, subsidize the papers. It's the experience of the controllers, and the controllers' experience is nothing to do with the vast majority of the people who read them, buy them, patronize them, whatever. It is the agenda to get maximum kind of circulation or maximum sale or maximum revenue. Nothing to do with the truth. Nothing whatsoever to do with the truth. And the truth is only an accidental event in the case of these publishers and controllers, and under their influences, the editors and the quote journalists. So it's a one-way kind of approach. And the way is away from the truth. Say, for example, the reader of the newspapers, like the Times, average reader of the Times, has experience of the reality between the UK's kind of attitude, generally as a government attitude, and the perception of the people outside, say in other countries, starting from other countries in Europe, going all the way to North Africa and then to Africa and the rest of the Asian continent. The people who have been abroad and have experience of exchanging, interacting with people in those countries have got a different understanding about the newspapers. And the more they know about the people abroad, the less they believe these newspapers, which are actually carrying lies and untruths and fantasy. As lethal as lies are the fantasies that they actually carry. So, this guy, born in southern Africa, Matthew Paris, was a Thatcherite kind of Tory, and he's still, by his own admission, he's a liar. He lied about a lot of things. I mean, the most important lie he perpetrated while still an MP was he said that he could live on the same amount of money received by the benefit claimers, etc., etc. He couldn't. But that was the lie that he created around himself with the publicity and all the rest of it. And years later, I mean, he lost or he left, stopped being an MP, and he became a quote journalist, and he's been given platforms as a columnist in the Times, and also he appears on the BBC and other outlets as a commentator sometimes. And he is the recipient of positive promotions by his fellow Tories and others. He is considered by them as a sensible person and has got his kind of mind connected with the reality. He's connected and he gets things right. That's their view. But we campaigned against him in 2005 after he wrote a piece supporting Crossrail, and he suggested that it was Ken Livingstone still in post, and he said to Livingstone that he should ram Crossrail through Brick Lane. He said he should drive Crossrail through Brick Lane. Matthew Paris, when people hear him on the radio, he comes up across as a soft accented, soft voiced person. But in that attack on Brick Lane, he came across as a fascist, as a hateful racist spewer. And he was driven in his hateful anti-Brick Lane sentiment by his hatred of the people who had voted a month or two before that for George Galloway. And George Galloway at that time was years away from staging another detour and becoming a supporter of the racists and Brexiteers. At that time, Galloway was just kind of celebrating his recently staged detour as the MP in the name of Bethnal Green and Bow. But Galloway at that time was very much the bad thing. Bad thing because supporters of Una King, who was kicked out by the voters at that same election in May 2005, supporters of Una King viewed George Galloway with total contempt, and George Galloway was seen as the worst thing to have happened at any election. And Matthew Paris was part of that crowd and that lobby and that kind of narrative. And so he said to Ken Livingstone, who was still in place, Ken Livingstone, still in place as the mayor at the expense of London, to ram and to drive Crossrail through Brick Lane and destroy it. As revenge, he said, as revenge and as a lesson for those who had voted for George Galloway. That is what Matthew Paris said. So I'm saying this today, years later, 15 years plus later, on Saturday, the 19th of September 2020, in order to create the contextual understanding of who this person is, before I quote him on a couple of paragraphs in the Times, of, on page 29 of the Times today. And then we shall go to the mental slave, Terrible Phillips, on pages 36 to 37 of the Times. So this one is page 29 of the Times comment section. And the headline to the column by Matthew Paris says, Johnson Zing has well and truly zung. There's a play on the word. What he's saying is that Johnson has lost it and he's no longer worth supporting. And he's saying that Boris Johnson has lost it and lost it. He's saying, this is the paragraph that I want to read first. He's talking about Johnson-fronted cabal's failure on COVID-19. He's saying, if it were just over COVID, whatever, where uncertainty is the norm, some would sympathize with our PM. Well, I don't agree with the word some uncertainty. That is not the word I would use. It is pandemonium, but let's continue again. If it were just over COVID, where uncertainty is the norm, some would sympathize with our PM. Some still do. But take this summer's row about A-levels and off-quell. It's fashionable to sneer at Gavin Williamson and mock his accent. But if the Education Secretary should have seen this coming, so should the Prime Minister. What steer, what support did Johnson give? My guess is that he will have whistled and looked the other way. And how could a PM who knew or cared about the quality of his cabinet have shrugged shoulders at the rank inadequacy of his Home Secretary, Priti Patel? People do get the message. Like many weak bosses, Johnson is frightened of competition or discord. Finally, the Internet Market Bill. Posturing is common enough in politics, but to attempt a David and Goliath confrontation with Brussels and then slingshot yourself in the foot is a fiasco. The whole shaming episode was entirely predictable, as is its conclusion. The bill will sink. And so we end up with the rancid shambles of a government. The confusion is inseparable from the character of its leader. Is it, then, too late for Johnson? Could he yet wind back and start again? I end, as I began, with the words of John Randolph, reflecting on his own career and how time misspent and faculties misemployed and senses jaded by labor are impaired by excess, cannot be recalled any more than that freshness of the heart before it has become aware of the deceits of others and of its own. So he is writing accurately enough about Johnson being finished. Now, in my observation, Johnson never was fit for the purpose. Fit for the purpose, never, because for 25 years, Johnson has been lying on the record. And Johnson has been repeatedly caught lying. Remember, it's not about his competence. It's about his lying, about his dishonesty. That is his craft. And as I keep referring to his sister, Rachel Johnson, and his father, Stanley Johnson, who are among his most avid promoters, they encouraged him. The whole family has encouraged his lying. to the point that it has become part of the trademark. If Johnson lies, then they are satisfied. And if Johnson doesn't lie kind of cruelly enough, and if he doesn't say things against other people cruelly enough, then they express publicly the opinion that he should have been more cruel and more racist, as they did about the attack on Muslim women wearing the headgear or head cover, whom he accused of looking like bank robbers. And both Rachel Johnson and his father Stanley Johnson said that in condemning Muslim women wearing headgears and looking like bank robbers, Boris Johnson had not condemned them enough. They deserve more condemnation. And both of them said, Rachel Johnson and her father, and Boris Johnson's father, Stanley Johnson, that in that statement, Boris Johnson had not gone far enough. That's the rancidity, that's the stench of racist stupidity and denial in the whole family. At least as the family is represented by Rachel Johnson, his sister, and Stanley Johnson, his father. So this person that this commentator, this Times commentator Matthew Paris is saying, has come to the end of his zing, is not somebody who should have been allowed the zing in the first place. And everything about him has been artificially created, including his speeches. When the Brexit kind of option was kind of on offer or on the table, he was expected to make a speech about whether he was supporting the yes to the Brexit question, that the UK should be coming out of the EU, or no, saying that the UK should stay in the EU. He wrote two speeches. He didn't do that on the principle at all. He wrote two speeches depending on the outcome. So he went for the Brexit option, and this was the one that got through. So if it had actually been defeated, he would have delivered the other speech. If the Brexit had been a no, if the outcome of the referendum had been a no, then he would have said that he supported the stance of the UK remaining in the EU. So it's not like it was a secret. He had written two different speeches. So the guy is completely without principle. And it is that actually sums up the evidence that he is without principle. So Matthew Perry is saying that he is probably run out of the zing and it is zang now, is not something that is timely or truthful. It is the obvious thing that Johnson was not fit for the purpose and fit for the service and fit for the office, and he lied everywhere. He was sacked by Michael Howard for lying. He was sacked, and he was sent to Liverpool to apologize to the people of Liverpool for insulting them. Now, it is the same town, the same area, the same region that Rupert Murdoch's son accused of lying when they lost their children, their loved ones, in the Hillsborough disaster nearly 30 years ago. And the son is still banned by most people who don't read it and don't want to mention it. So Boris Johnson was as bad in his contempt towards the people, English people of Liverpool. And especially, he condemned them despite the knowledge that these people have been the victims of such a grievous injustice done by the son, accusing them and their loved ones of having asked for it or having caused the tragedy. And so therefore, Although Johnson's zing has well and truly zang, according to Matthew Paris, the rest of the Times, because the Times is the kind of pretentious cover for Rupert Murdoch. It's the pretentious cover that actually hides the extent of the poison that the sun and the scum. It has the kind of sort of resemblance with the reality. That is why the likes of Matthew Paris are given a platform there. I mean, Matthew Paris is writing there, not the overt racist like Trevor Kavanagh, who has the permanent slot on the Sun, the scum, which he politically edited for a while. Well, for a number of years before he was succeeded by somebody else. Now, these people are spewing hatred through the media. And the cover of the kind of semi-respectability and semi-truthfulness that the Times maintains with people like that is really a tactical cover. It's not because Murdoch or the Times want to tell the truth. It is a tactical thing because they want to half pretend to be honest and half dishonest. And there is always, every day, they have got 3 or at least 2 editorials which are kind of complicated, compromised, and contradictory. They never say the truth straight away. They have got a kind of contradictory thing to make up for the truth, as if telling the truth without any condition is too much for them. And the letters column is full of kind of European names, as I have been saying. There is no letter from anyone whose name is not European. So the Times is living on a planet that is completely in denial, because most of the resources, most of the economic kind of resources and income, so-called, that British economy receives is from the rest of the world and not from the rest of Europe only. Well, European Union is a tactical market kind of bloc, but the actual target is the rest of the world, of the economic trade and everything. And the relationship is at the expense of the rest of the world. So I'm not kind of accepting for a moment that the EU is some kind of pure moral, ethical thing. It is just a question of international treaties and obligations and that sort of thing that I was kind of using as the criteria to judge the behavior of the Brexiteers. So their editorial comment pages are full of European names and they are in denial. And the letters page full of European names that constitute the Times continuing to being in denial of the rest of the world. In fact, the rest of the world is the main provider of the income to the UK. And there is no evidence, neither in the Times, nor in the Guardian, nor in the Daily Mirror, of that equation or that relationship that the UK is dependent on Africa and Asia for most of its income and its resources. Think about that. So the diagnosis of the media is not just about headlines and the lying, but it's the deepest denial by all the outlets, the Guardian, the Times, the Boris Graph, and most significantly and tellingly, the Financial Times. I mean, the name is a giveaway. It's the Financial Times, but it should be called the Financial Lying Times, or the Times, the financial kind of Times that is actually telling lies every time, so many times in the week. The Financial Times lies about the finance and the financial kind of dependence by the European or the European countries, European economies on the rest of the world, on Asia, Africa, and other parts in the Caribbean as well. Not forgetting for a moment the economic dependence, serious dependence, and the financial corruption. It is the financial corruption, hedge funders' corruption that the name Britain and the UK actually conjure up, and they actually provide, quote, safe passages to billionaire financial crooks from all over the world to perpetrate, confect their corruption and robbery and launder them through British institutions. The foremost British institution being the City of London. That's where the laundering takes place. As yesterday's paper revealed, the Times, admitted there are 50 billion pounds of coins and notes in circulation. Nobody knows who owns them and where they come from. 50 billion, not a few million, 50 billion. That is not the whole picture I am saying. It is only a tip of the iceberg. There must be hundreds of billions worth of currency and worth of kind of financial transactions taking place illicitly, illegally, and with the use or use of the City of London and its offshore kind of counterparts and equivalents. So the fact that the UK is, celebrating the various bargaining points, which is to believe the Daily Express that the EU negotiators have agreed to allow the City of London and to act as the market or the platform for various banks and others to operate until 2022 is not incidental. It's not an accident. It is part of the network of financial corruption that has been built over decades. It's nothing to do with the partisan or UK versus EU kind of bargaining. It is part of a wider, deeper kind of entrenchment of the Western European money laundering economies. Most of the economies are corrupt and false and fabricated. As I've been saying, the other thing is the war trade. They need the arms trade to continue. And in order for the arms trade to continue, they need wars to continue. And in order for wars to continue, they need excuses to make wars and cause wars. Simple as that. It may sound simple as I put it, but it is that actually consumes most of their energies in confecting various racist excuses, anti-Muslim hatred, and the whole crisis now in the kind of actively going in Africa and in the North African countries and in Egypt. Although Egypt is not in the news, but Egypt has got a lot of problems caused by these forces and supported by these forces, and Yemen, and the deal between Israel and the other two countries, smaller countries in the region. All of these are being prompted by war kind of agenda, war trading, war selling, and the villains are invented. The villains are invented. People are being accused of being dangers and threats and all that. These are created images in order to create the hysteria active. And without the hysteria being active, they can't do the business of selling arms and causing wars. And most of those people, the customers and the war engaged and war ravaged countries are in Asia and in Africa. So that is the economy. It's not the economy, that is the economy, and it is prompted by the military industrial complex and the agenda of the newspapers, very much moderated by these. And so therefore I go back to the front page of the Times and look at Alamuddin. Alamuddin. She's a Lebanese person who has given up her name and taken Clooney. Now, why she took the Clooney is not something I'm going to examine now, but it is not acceptable. And she has staged this quitting the role as a, what has she done? Amal Clooney has quit as the government's envoy on media freedom in protest at Boris Johnson's lamentable plans to break the law over Brexit. If that is the case, and literally let's say that that is the case in terms of her kind of being pegged or pegging her resignation to that one. But what are the details? The details of Clooney are mentioned in this one, this side issue or side piece that is headed Amal Clooney resigns as media envoy over move to break treaty. And they're saying Amal Clooney has resigned as the government's envoy on media freedom over Boris Johnson's plan to renege on parts of the Brexit withdrawal agreement. In a letter to Dominic Raab, the former Foreign Secretary, Ms. Clooney said that she was dismayed to learn that the government intends to pass legislation, the Internal Market Bill, which would, by the government's own admission, break international law if enacted. The resignation of Ms. Clooney, a human rights lawyer, comes days after Lord Keane of Ely, the Advocate General for Scotland, left the government in protest at ministers' approach to the international treaty governing the UK's departure from the EU. Ms. Clooney, a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers in London, said that she found it lamentable for the UK to be speaking of its intention to violate an international treaty signed by the Prime Minister less than a year ago. In her letter to Mr. Raab, who is also a lawyer, Ms. Clooney, 42, said that out of respect for the professional working relationship I have developed with you and your senior colleagues working on human rights, I deferred writing this letter until I had a chance to discuss this matter with you directly. But having now done so and received no assurance that any change of position is imminent, I have no alternative but to resign from my position. Keir Starmer, Labour leader, who is a barrister, used to practice at the same chambers as Miss Clooney, said he was not surprised by her decision. Like others, she's concluded that there is a conflict between a breach of international law, which the government seems intent on, and our reputation as a country in the world that abides by the rule of law. He told the what? That they don't continue their sentence. So they've left that sentence incomplete. So he probably told somebody or Times. Well, that is a completely unacceptable stance painted by the Times of these two persons, Amal Clooney and Keir Starmer. Both their statements are incomplete because if Amal Clooney actually had any regard for treaty violations and all the rest of it, then she should never have accepted any role with the government because they have been breaking international treaties all the time. And Keir Starmer is absolutely wrong to say that the country has a reputation for the rule of law. The country has a reputation for promoting, boasting of having rule of law, regard for rule of law, but there is no record. There is no evidence that substantiates any assertion to the effect that the country abides by the rule of law. And as I have been saying for the last few weeks, all these attacks on the migrants and the proxy role being assigned to the Kent County Council to harass the migrants and the Daily Mail's continuing subversion of the entitlements by these migrants to seek refuge. These are all breaches of international law. And as I have said, the 1951 Refugee Convention is the first one that comes to mind. And the latest updates and various declarations and statements by the United Nations members have also been violated by Britain all the time, every time. And the Greek assault on the island, on the camp where the asylum seekers were living, constitutes evidence of collusion between Britain and Greece and other countries of the other member countries of the EU. So the Brexit thing is absolutely false, as I've said, and it is falsified further by the daily evidence of contradiction and pretension. And so therefore Amal Clooney is not being honest about her own principles in resigning, because she has ignored and overlooked the daily breaches of international law and treaties and UK anti-discrimination legislation by the government, which has been happening every single day. And she has not made any statement. She has not made any play about any of that as to where she stands about any of it. And so therefore, we don't accept that Amal Clooney is being honest or Keir Starmer is being honest. But that is on the record, evidence constituting ground to dismiss the Times and Amal Clooney and Keir Starmer, all of them, dismiss them as being less than honest, less than kind of reliable, and less than abiding the principles of the international agreements and treaties and conventions and declarations and charters that affect the rights of people, all the people that have been affected by the violations and the breaches and the denials by the government. And that includes the failure of Boris Johnson-fronted regime to provide necessary support and necessary funding and necessary accountability on the pandemonium that it has kind of demonstrated in response to the pandemic and the COVID-19 in the last 8 months. And I think that that is the basis for saying that there is no outlet, including the Times, and as I said in the caveat, the qualifications that the Times, despite the fact that it is controlled by Rupert Murdoch and it's controlled by a kind of empire, media empire that is built on lies and denials and racism, the Times still remains the kind of very tiny kind of link, but it is the one that is linked to the kind of 200-year-old kind of tradition of Fleet Street on the newspaper of record and so forth. And it still has kind of residual connection with the truth and telling the truth. But it is nowhere near telling the truth any more than the Sun is, or the Daily Mail is, or the Daily Express is, or the Daily Star, or the Boris Graph is. And the Boris Graph is there to be seen yet. We haven't seen the Boris Graph yet. We shall do so in a very short while. And there is this kind of slightly different story on the Times on the same page, page 7. Labour now neck and neck in polls. So Labour is kind of moving in terms of the poll, moving in the direction of getting. So they're saying that Labour has gained 3 points and the Conservatives, Boris Johnson-fronted Conservatives, have lost 2 points. And the Lib Dems have lost but not in any single figure number that they can mention. So the Johnson personally is 31%. Who do you think would make the best prime minister? And the answer is Johnson would make the best prime minister 31%. And don't know said 35%. And in between is Starmer with 34%. So Starmer is 3 percentage points ahead of Johnson as the answer given to the people polled, who said that Starmer would make the best prime minister. 34% said that. To what extent, if at all, would you trust Labour to handle the following issues in government? So there are threes: economy 34%, Brexit 29%, and the economy 34% yes, and 43% no. And the Brexit 29% yes, 45% no. And don't know about economy is 23%, and about the Brexit 26%. And their answer about how Labour would deal with the COVID-19 outbreak, the answer is 38% say yes, 36% say no. And on housing, the answer is 41% say yes and 33% say no. And this is a piece by policy editor Oliver Wright, whose first paragraph is Labour has drawn level with Conservatives in opinion polls for the first time since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister last year. So this is, in that context, kind of historic or a moment to note. In a boost for Sir Keir Starmer on the eve of his first virtual party conference, a YouGov poll for the Times found both main parties tied on 40%. Labour was up 3 points from the last survey, while the Conservatives were declined by 2. The Lib Dems were unchanged on 6%, but their actual kind of graph or list shows them minus, although there is no unit of number in the decline, but there is a minus sign there. So the Labour Party is almost equal to the Conservatives in terms of the poll rating. But our diagnosis is not about polls, because we do not accept that the 3 election wins by Tony Blair, and we call him Blair uniquely because of his lying record, and we started calling him Blair late in 1997, a few months after he got in. And we had already looked at the evidence and tendency and propensity to lie on his part. And they're now running this story about London and lockdown in London, about the imminence of the lockdown and compared to the north of England. So then these papers are London-centric, English-centric papers. They don't recognize Wales and they don't recognize Scotland. They don't recognize Ireland. This needs to be said, and this is what is happening. All the coverage, all the contents are about England and London, and that is it. I mean, they don't recognize the world either. If you look at the map, and if you look at the number of people on either criteria, the UK as a whole is small compared to most countries in Asia and Africa. And yet, if you go by the newspaper, the contents, the copy, you would think that there is no world. So that is a biggest collective denial of the world. And that's the mentality that is entirely kind of formed on the basis of denial, fed by empire. I mean, they've got used to thinking that there is no world. The main world, the main play, the main activities, the main decisions about the world are happening in London, in Britain, in England. That's not the case. But that is the fantasy that is fed by the Times and the other papers as well. And there are itsy bitsy pieces here about Spain. They're talking about what measures the Spanish are taking about combating the spread of the virus. And we shall be talking about this piece they have given to Trevor the Terrible Phillips, the mental slave, on page 30, I think from memory, 36, is it? So they've got a 2-page spread about Churchill in the middle, Churchill statue. And this piece is by the mental slave Trevor Terrible Phillips. Now, why do I call him Trevor Terrible Phillips? Because he is a terrible kind of purveyor and courier of lies, racist lies, denials, and as an agent of racists spewing against Muslims and against African and Asian people. Although he may deny that he is anti-African as he is anti-Asian, but he is that. He has been that. So that's the 2-page spread on the Times that Trevor Terrible Phillips is given. That's not given to anyone else, especially anyone who will be diagnosing the lies and the myths and the racism and the denials and the ignorance and the stupidity and the corruption. They won't do that. So he's saying in this piece, whoever wrote this thing, or maybe a sub-editor wrote this or an editor, because this must be one of the pieces that Terrible Phillips has confected to come across as being more kind of supportive of the English racist patriotism than even the most brazen Englishistic racist patriot. When he says, when you erase a nation's past, you threaten its future, he's talking about Churchill. He is condemning the critics of Winston Churchill. And as we have said, as can be found, one of the Indian diplomats who served in the United Nations for a number of years, Shashi Tharoor, has been a member of Indian Parliament. Shashi Tharoor actually made an extensive study of the role that Winston Churchill played in causing the famine in 1943 that massacred 3 million people or more, mainly in Bengal. I mean, that was in 1943. So that included today's West Bengal and today's Bangladesh and other parts in the neighborhood. And as I have recalled, I mean, the impact of the famine was still raging as I was growing up. And I felt the impact of it in the country. And it is absolutely something that cannot be treated slightly, which is what the Terrible Phillips is doing. He is putting the attackers of Churchill's legacy, the racist legacy, as being in the wrong. So that's what Trevor Terrible Phillips is doing, and that's why he is Terrible Phillips, who has internalized the racist narrative and agenda and apologies. So he's acting as an apologist for the racists. Now, at the University of Sheffield in 1976, I had a direct encounter with the Trevor Terrible Phillips in 1976 when he was in post as the secretary of the National Union of Students. And I was organizing the campaign against the racist criteria that were used to raise the tuition fees against overseas students. And I had other people present with me confronting Terrible Phillips, who was forced to go to Sheffield to meet us as part of the attempt to stop our campaign against the rise of the overseas students' fees. And at that meeting, I asked him 4 questions, none of which Terrible Phillips could answer. And my colleagues on the campaigning side were surprised that I could ask those questions and that he couldn't answer those questions. Now, that was not the only time that happened. Me versus the crooks. This happens all the time. So, Terrible Phillips is somebody I have had the kind of need, if you like, to study and observe and diagnose now for what? It's more than 40 years, isn't it? Since 76, so it's 44 years. I have been suffering the ordeal of having to look at his latest kind of evidence of his behavior, misbehavior. And he is nothing but a mental slave and a denier in pay of the deniers and the racists. And he is not contributing to the campaign for democracy, accountability, let alone ending racism. He's part and parcel of the racists. And the fact that he, quote, co-wrote a book about the Windrush generation with his older brother, Mike Phillips, whom I know as a colleague. And Mike Phillips is his brother, but he's not played anything like this kind of servile, pro-racist, mental slavish role. One example is when Mike Phillips was asked a question by one channel of the BBC after Barack Obama was elected president of the USA the first time. Mike Phillips gave a negative answer. He did not celebrate Obama's election. And the reasons were obvious because Mike Phillips said that he was not a genuine campaigner against slavery or racism and the history of racism and all the other things that are correct factually. Now, contrasted to that by Mike Phillips, his biological brother, Trevor Terrible Phillips, is the opposite. He is the courier of the message of the racists. He is the courier and explainer, apologist for the tradition and record of Winston Churchill. And not only that, he actually in the late 1970s or very early 1980s, I think, it would be very early 1980s, not that later than that. There was this Peregrine Wollstone. Peregrine Wollstone was the editor of the Sunday Times. And Wollstone was a racist as well. And Wollstone was being regularly criticized during his time as the Sunday Telegraph editor for being racist. So imagine who should step in to save the image of Peregrine Wollstone. It was Trevor Terrible Phillips. Trevor Terrible Phillips, quote, confected himself into a position of having the chair of an event held in the Friends Meeting House in Houston. In one room in the Friends Meeting House in Houston. And in the crowd, in the audience, was Mike Phillips as well as myself, not standing next to one another, but I saw Mike Phillips, and he may have seen me or not, I don't know, but I was there. And I was there, as always, to gather evidence firsthand. And when Mike Phillips said something which is completely innocuous and something very basic question about racism and the role of the media, whether he named Wollstone or not is not something that I can recall, but he asked a very plain question. And the first thing that slave, this mental slave, Trevor Terrible Phillips, did to his own older brother at that public meeting was say, "Shut up, Mike." That happened in front of me. I'll never forget that. "Shut up, Mike." Now that is the kind of evidence, exclusive, world exclusive evidence, that I base my comments on, my descriptions of the likes of the Terrible Phillips on. Now, this is a two-page thing on the Times, which is one, two, three, four, five, six big paragraphs, wide paragraphs. And I have to read something from that, not all of it, of course, not most of it. And he is saying that so he conflates this Terrible Phillips conflates the history of the French Revolution, and he completely misquotes and misrefers to Thomas Paine and the American Revolution and all the rest of it. And he messes up the history of the Caribbean people against slavery, and he identifies himself as an Englishman, as a British kind of person. Either he is a descendant of the Caribbean people who were enslaved, or he is a perpetrator or a descendant collaborator of the racists who are now denying the role that Churchill played in creating the genocide and causing the genocide that killed millions of Bengali people in 1943. He's saying that it is censorship. Those who want kind of to destroy Churchill's kind of statue, etc., are doing censorship. And he's saying censorship of the past is merely the warm-up for the crushing of dissent in the future. If we, I mean, who does he mean by we? If we remove the reminders of where we have been, we take away the signposts to the cul-de-sacs. Fascism, communism, and genocide. Now, this is Trevor Phillips has been supporting fascists and communists and genocides. How can he pretend to be opposing those? So I said that the Times is being dishonest in giving him that two-page spread, and actually doing so on purpose because he is black-skinned and he is the official nephew Tom that has been in employment of the racists in Britain for the last 50 years. That is the actual evidence of his role and his kind of timing. So we'll be continuing next with the Boris Graf and the Financial Times. This is 20 minutes past 11 GMT in the morning of Saturday, the 19th of September 2020.